Jay, what is one of your favorite events that you have ever covered?
Wow, that's a great question to get right at it. I would probably say, and I didn't know it at the time, NC State's championship in 1983. I mean, I've had the privilege of being an eyewitness to so many cool things over 43 years. But who would have known that I would end up being the only television person to see every game NC State played at the ACC tournament all the way through the Final Four when they beat Houston in Albuquerque in 1983.
Wow.
It's silly. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I remember this past basketball ACC tournament, they were talking about all the parallels and everything like that. I guess going into that ACC tournament, was there any expectation? And was that still the time where you had to win the ACC tournament to make the major tournament?
You could make the tournament on a by invitation, but they were in a position where they had to win. There was little doubt that they had enough wins and enough in the tournament. I can't remember how many teams were in the tournament at that time. It wasn't that many, but they had to win the tournament to get into the NCAA's.
Okay, so college basketball championship 1983. Yep, you were there in person.
Yep, I was.
Where were you, and what was it like after they won at the buzzer?
Oh man, so I was there with Bob Holliday, who was my running mate for so many parts of my sports days at WRAL. We were in Albuquerque, and we were not allowed to shoot the game itself. We had to take a feed from the network, which was CBS at the time. So I was in another part of the building, and we had decided we were going to get our camera, and get in position so we could run onto the floor. We hoped at the end of the game, no matter what happened.
Okay.
So Bob and I were actually in the tunnel leading to the floor of the pit where the game was played, University of New Mexico. And so NC State's shooting at the far end, and I'm not very big. So, I'm looking through all these heads, and I can see the ball kind of bounce, as they're throwing around and all that sort of stuff. I can see a glimpse of Derek Wittenberg going up for a shot. The ball travels through the air. It disappears behind somebody's head, and the crowd behind the NC State basket erupts and cheers. So I thought, you could hear me on the tape say, it went in. Wittenberg's shot went in. Yeah. Well, it wasn't until we ran out on the floor, and it was actually Chancellor Bruce Polton, who told me when we were interviewing him. And he goes, "It was Charles on the dunk, on the dunk," and it was just, crazy. It was just, wow. And then, I said we hoped we could get on the floor. Well, we weren't on the floor long. The NCAA kicked us out after being on the court for about 5 minutes because apparently we weren't supposed to be there. But we were.
That's great. Now I know you were new to Raleigh when that happened ish. Are you an NC State fan because of or just it was just cool to be there?
Probably. One of the cool things about I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Southeast Missouri. And by moving here and covering, I moved here in March 1980. The timing could not have been any better. There's that line in the book of Esther that talks about for such a time as this. I rolled in for such a time as this. Two of the first events I covered when I got here, and I'll answer your question about the whole NC State thing in a second. Two of the first events I covered when I got here were Duke introducing new basketball coach Mike Krzyzewski.
Okay.
And NC State's new coach, Jim Valvano.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, it wasn't long, and Dean Smith's rolling at Carolina, James Worthy's at Carolina, Lawrence Taylor's playing at Carolina. It's like a golden age of ACC athletics. I was, as far as you're answering your NC State question, I wouldn't have said it at the time. I couldn't have said it at the time, quite frankly, because I was working in the sports department at WRAL. Yeah. I '83 really kind of sucked me in to the red and white. And one of the reasons was, remember, I was really young. So I was, let me do the math real quick, and I'm no good at math. I think I was 24 at the time.
Okay.
And so those NC State seniors are 22 years old. So I'm, so Thurl Bailey, Derek Wittenberg, Sidney Lowe, we're really of the same age. And so when they weren't playing, on more than one occasion, I was hanging out in their rooms. So I really got to know those guys. We watched a couple of movies together, in some of the locations, and it was again, I said it before, it was just ridiculous to have that opportunity to be there and have that front row seat.
So you're starting out at WRL in the 80s. Did you see Michael Jordan live, cover any of his games?
Covered,
Carolina?
yes. I covered his very first game at Carolina, which was in Charlotte against Kansas, and I probably shot 80 or 90% of his home games at Carmichael. And it was amazing to watch him over the years go from being, this really talented freshman who had tons of potential that, I'm no NBA scout, but you could see that he was going to be pretty good.
Right.
Had no idea that Mike Jordan from Wilmington was going to be Air Jordan in the NBA and, and the greatest player of all time.
I'm guessing you didn't get to watch movies with Michael Jordan.
No.
Okay.
No. Now here's a crazy thing. There was a time when two quick Michael Jordan stories. One, right out his, I think it was his. Oh, he was graduating. He was finishing up at Carolina, and we got a call from David Falk, which was the agent who represented Michael, saying, "Hey, we will." Can you send us footage of Michael playing at Carolina, because we need to put together a marketing package for some of these companies that we're trying to sign with, and we'll get you an interview, an exclusive one-on-one interview with Michael, after all this, after we nail all this stuff down. Well, it turns out if you saw, what was the movie with Ben Affleck and
I saw that that's 2 months ago. The Shoe Dog, I think maybe,
and that was the video they used to make the presentation to Nike.
At Nike, they used yours.
Yes.
Your stuff. Wow.
And so that's pretty cool. The downside of that is, I think WRA is still waiting for that one-on-one with Michael.
He owes you, man. He owes you a piece of the kingdom.
Well, my brother brings this up. My brother Jeff came out for a visit to North Carolina. I think it was, was it Michael's second year in the NBA? He had his knee injury and had to have surgery, and he was out for most of the year. But he spent up. That's kind of when he fell in love with playing golf. My brother Jeff and I went down to play golf at Pinehurst, and it was Pinehurst number 7, at the time the newest course, and we were finishing up our round, and I looked over on the number 1 tee box. And there was Michael and a couple of his buddies getting ready to tee off. And I just tell my brother, "Hey, come here. I want you to meet this guy." And, I don't think Michael would know me today. But he stopped and talked to me and remembered me and all that sort of stuff. And the funny thing is, I was just talking to my brother Jeff just the other day. And he goes, you introduced me. At the time, I had no idea who this guy was.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. Just, the crazy stuff like that.
Yeah. One other question as it pertains to college basketball, especially the media side. So you go from, 1983, you're covering all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Now they're doing the Final Four in football stadiums.
Yep.
I mean, how different was that compared to what it was when you started out?
It was, that was a big change because, as a matter of fact, I was actually at the last Final Four that was played at an arena, which was when Duke lost to UNLV in Denver.
Wow. 90, 1990?
Yes, I believe it was. And
Duke fan here, so.
Yeah, there you go. Because then the next year they beat UNLV in Indy in the, at the time what they called the Hoosier Dome. But that was crazy because I remember being in 82 going to the Final Four with Bob Holliday. and they're in the Superdome. I remember going out for the first practice and just looking up, thinking, they're going to play basketball in this joint? I mean, it was like being inside the mothership, you know? Yeah. It was incredible. And I actually went up. Bob was always gracious enough at some point in the game. Usually we would always just get one reporter seat somewhere for in the arena, and the lowly photographer had to go to the bowels of the stadium somewhere and plug in his video recorder to get the video feed from the truck. But Bob was always gracious enough to say, "Hey, you want to come sit up and watch some of the game?" But I remember in the second half of the championship game against Georgetown, just thinking, "My God!" I was in the football press box. That's where Bob's seat was, and it was just it was hard to imagine watching a game. It was, those things, Dylan. That's as a sports fan, sometimes it's less about having a good seat than being there.
Yeah.
I quick story on the whole stadium thing. In 2001, being a Duke fan, they were in Minneapolis that year.
That's right.
And I was with David Crabtree that year, covering it for the news side, and we did an interview with Les Robinson, who was on the NCAA selection committee that year, and so we got done interviewing Les. This was, I think, the day before the day of the championship game, and he asked us, "So you guys going to the game?" Well, we did. As news people, we didn't have credentials to go in, so no, we didn't. Go. He said, "You want tickets?" Sure. So Les gets us tickets. We go into the Metrodome, the old Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome, and we keep, we show our tickets, and they keep directing us here and there, and we end up, I am not kidding you, on the last row in center field. We couldn't have been any farther from the court. And on top of that, I remember having a cell phone. It was one of the first times I had a cell phone for work. Calling my dad because I knew he'd want to know. He'd be really excited the fact that I was at the Final Four. The speaker was right above my head.
Okay.
So every time they blew the horn for anybody to come in and out of the game or a timeout.
Yeah.
So my dad never heard my voice. He just heard the horn, blaring about a dozen times for about 30 seconds. I wonder too,
is it? I mean, I know being there is really cool.
Yeah.
But at that point, you're so far away. Is it worth it when you're at like a football stadium watching a basketball game?
We watch, yes and no. I mean, I'm all about being there. I'm all about. I love the environment, and I can remember as a kid having conversations with my dad and my grandfather, who had season tickets to the NFL team in St. Louis, the old St. Louis Cardinal football team. They would say, "I don't want to go to the game. It's better see it on television." I'm going, "What are you kidding me, man? I want to be at the stadium."
Yeah.
And they're like, "Well, and this was in the days when there were no replays on the Jumbotron or any of that sort of stuff." So, but I've always been I want to be there kind of guy.
That's cool. Now, I asked you, we've been talking about your favorite event that you covered. You covered a lot.
Yep.
Obviously, being in Raleigh, NC State's a big deal.
Yep.
You also covered the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what did you cover, and what was that like?
So, that's a crazy story too, because we were in WRAL was an ABC affiliate at the time. The games were on ABC that year, and so, but they were not giving credentials, press passes to anybody who wasn't a major market. So if you weren't in New York, LA, Chicago, Dallas, you weren't getting a press pass. So we went without a press pass, without any credentials. As a matter of fact, we worked a lot of times we would tag team with one of the other sports departments in North Carolina to cover stuff. So, to get more bang for the buck. And so I went with Brett McMillan from WSOC in Charlotte. We would share stories. So basically we do one story, write and edit one story, and we just change the voice on it. One for WRAL with my voice and one for WSOC with his voice. All that to say, we went with Brett without credentials, and so we were having to line up all our stories ahead of time. Again, this is 1984. We didn't have cell phones.
Right.
There was no email. So we're doing everything by phone, trying to line all these stories up ahead of time, saying, hey, would you meet me here at this time, because we wanted to do an interview about this. And so we actually did really well. There was a couple athletes we were able to work out ahead of time who would meet us outside the Olympic Village, which was actually at Southern Cal. And then a couple other folks. There was a young kid who was going to Duke, who was a basketball player, who was, I think, would have been a sophomore at the time, who was pulling cable for ABC radio. His name was Jay Billis.
Oh, wow.
And so I remember interviewing. We shot an interview with Jay right outside the Fabulous Forum, and we lined up an interview with Coach Valvano. He was doing CBS radio.
Yeah. And I would say, for those who don't know, Jay Billis is the lead ESPN basketball analyst, broadcaster for their games. So
he is. Yeah. Billis is. I mean, he's the go-to guy on all things college basketball for ESPN.
I guess like Michael Jordan, he owes some of it to you. I mean,
well, let's put it this way: Billis still had hair when we interviewed him. So, no, it was pretty great. And so the other cool thing about that was, we were, like I said, we were an ABC station, and Brett worked for an ABC station in Charlotte. Our management team was there, and they were calling us all the time saying, "Hey, the networks keeps giving us these tickets. We can't use them all. Do you want to go to boxing or basketball or rowing or all of that?" So, like, they gave us tickets. I know 2 sets of tickets they gave us were for USA basketball, USA men's basketball, and so that was really the dream team while they were all still in college.
Yeah.
And that was Bob Knight coaching Jordan and Perkins and Isaiah and all that.
Did they win that year? Or?
Oh yeah. Yes, and we saw them play Canada, which was a really good game, a relatively good game. I mean, U.S. won going away in every game, and Uruguay, that basketball power from South America, Uruguay. Right. So no, it was great. It was a great experience, fantastic. And we were there. The Olympics is generally 2 weeks. And we were there for, I think, the Friday prior, and we left on the following Sunday. So we were there basically the first full week of the Olympics.
Okay.
And so we also got to see some track and field, some volleyball, boxing, team handball. There was a young lady from Eastern North Carolina who was on the U.S. women's team handball team.
Okay.
Yeah, it was great.
That's cool. And I just, maybe clearly for me, your title when you did WRAL was photographer.
Yeah, I was.
But it sounds like you're doing all this. You're recording videos, interviews.
Yeah, I was kind of a multi-tool. Okay. I was kind of we called it at the time a one-man band, but now it's referred to in the industry as a multimedia journalist. It just means you got to do it all yourself.
Yeah, that's great.
And so when I started there, I started as the sports photographer, and then I had a background in reporting coming out of University of Missouri. So due to some personnel changes and shortages, I actually got to start reporting for WRAL Sports really early. By, I think it was early '81. I was, they needed somebody else who could go out and do a story and put their voice on it. So I started doing that. So I did that for a while. And then sometime in the mid to late 80s, I became the chief photographer for the newsroom at WRAL. Did that for a couple of years. And then eventually transitioned into, I guess it was about 92. They asked me if I would become the documentary photographer. That just meant I worked on stuff that was of half hour and longer length. And that's really what I did for probably 25 plus of my 43 years there.
Okay. That's really cool. Now, you've also interviewed a number of people, including this guy who's, some people might have heard of him, this guy named Billy Graham.
Yes.
So when was that? Were you the person that actually interviewed him? What was
No,
going on?
no.
Okay, but you were there.
No.
When was that? What was it like?
So he was Reverend Graham was getting ready to do his first crusade in Charlotte, which is his hometown. And I can't remember how many decades it had been a long time since he'd been there. And Bill Leslie had been pursuing an interview with Reverend Graham for years, and finally there was a press availability at his home in Montreat, at Reverend Graham's home in Montreat, that we received an invitation to. And so we went there, and it was, it wasn't very big. I mean, it was not a one-on-one interview. I don't want to make it into something that it wasn't. Yeah. But there were only a handful of cameras and reporters who were there that day. That was pretty sweet. But a couple years later, so that would have been, I think that was 97. In 2000, I'm trying to remember what the timeline is. I think it's around 2001, he was doing another crusade in Louisville, and we had never covered him. Here's where the technology piece comes in. He was doing a crusade in Louisville, and we had not shot him with any of our high definition equipment yet. And we just thought that would be something that's really, really important. So Bill and I, again, went out. I went with Bill, and we went to Louisville and covered that crusade. And the cool thing about that was that while it wasn't an interview, we were going to the hotel where all the Graham people were staying to interview. I can't remember if it was George Beverly Shea or Cliff Barrows, those were the two of the longtime members of Reverend Graham's team. I can't remember who it was, but we pulled up in the parking lot. We're getting our gear out of our car, and we start to walk in, and I hear Bill say, "Oh my gosh, that's Billy Graham." I look up, and there's Reverend Graham getting out of the car like 3 cars away from us with his assistant, and he's getting ready to. We're going to walk in. The 4 of us are going to walk in together, and he just turns to us and says, and introduces himself. Ask where we're from. He's asking questions of us, which I think is the humility of a guy like that. He's just so inquisitive and just wants to know about you. He cares. He cares about you. Yeah. And I can remember. Excuse me. But I remember he said he found out we were from Raleigh, and he said, "Well, you may know my daughter Ann. She lives in Raleigh." Yeah. And which Bill and I did because we'd interviewed her a couple times, but it's not like Ann and her husband lived down on the same cul-de-sac with us. But that was great. I mean, that was actually to me as cool as going to the press availability and covering the Crusades. As cool as that was, I cherish that little interaction in a hotel parking lot in Louisville. That's a real treat for me.
Yeah, that's cool. Now I asked this question originally. I was going to ask, do you have a favorite college professional athlete that you've maybe interviewed? I know you've interviewed, worked with a lot of people, so you could keep it just to sports or maybe outside if you want. But maybe who's someone that sticks out that you had a good experience with or really enjoyed the interview or the interaction?
I'll tell you who I've had an interaction with, probably more interaction with than anybody is going to be, and you're going to love this one, is Mike Krzyzewski.
The GOAT.
Yep. So a little bit of a backstory. Of course, everything with me has a backstory. So in covering those days when I was in the sports department, obviously I'm shooting a lot of Duke basketball. And, I mean, going to Cameron Indoor Stadium, by the way, is just, I mean, the early days when I got here, I'm going to Reynolds, Carmichael, and Cameron. All 3 are phenomenal places to watch a basketball game. But going to Cameron, so I'm covering a lot of Duke basketball. And at the time, Coach K's TV show, WRL produced that show. So he was coming to the studios a lot, and they were editing all his stuff there. And so it was Tommy Amaker's senior year. So that would have been what year? Do you remember? 80?
before my time, but I think in the 80s, maybe the
I think it's
80s,
85, 86, somewhere in there.
Okay.
If my son were sitting here,
Yes.
he'd tell me the exact date. But anyway, Duke approached me and WRAL saying, "Hey, would you allow Jay to edit a tribute video for Tommy for his senior year? We want to honor his career." And Jay's got all the footage because he shot so many of his games. So they agreed, and so I edited that year, and then they liked it so much they came back the next year and kept asking. So I kept so starting that year, I edited the videos that they would play at the Duke banquet at the end of the year.
Okay.
And had a lot of interaction with Coach K. Had more interaction with his wife Mickey, because Mickey would come over to the TV station, and we would sit in an edit bay for, from 7 o'clock in the evening till about 3 o'clock in the morning for about 5 days, editing these videos after I got done with my work each day. And so I got to know Mickey. I also got to know Mike, and he's one of those guys, and I'm sure some of you may have seen his. He's got a pretty sharp wit. If he starts digging on you, if he starts going after you, he likes you. And I've been on the receiving end of several of those, and he's just a great guy. It's amazing to think that he really almost got fired. After a couple of years. Man, I just here's a guy who didn't compromise his principles to do what he knew but on the other hand, didn't compromise his principles, but also changed.
Yeah.
He went from being I'm only going to run this style of offense, and I'm only going to run man-to-man defense. No, his system changed with whatever players he had, which I thought was all part of his genius.
Yeah, that's great. Now, if I ever, I guess we'll pull some strings. We'll get Mike Krzyzewski on the podcast next. That'd be great.
Let's do it.
Speaking of, you've done a lot of sports. You've done a lot of documentaries.
Yep.
I'm sure you could answer this. I mean, this could be a big question.
Yeah.
But I'm always curious, whenever I watch a documentary, it's like, that's a lot of stuff, and they really condense it down to 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, pretty much. And I don't know how you would answer this, but how in the world do you take all of this information? Maybe it's, to me, like when I read a book, like a biography or a historical book on something, and I'm like, how do they?
Yeah, like what do you put in and what do you leave out?
Yeah, it's like, it's just like, you got all this footage, all this information. How do you get to the final product?
Well, first of all, I've worked with I got to think about this, four great producers over the years, who are gracious enough to allow me to have a pretty heavy hand in the production of these documentaries. But really, the producer, and I worked with a guy named Chris Albro, and then Scott Mason, who's now the Tar Heel Traveler. Scott came to WRAL to be the documentary producer. Then I worked with Clay Johnson, I worked with Clay for 17 years producing docs, and then Kristen Severance, who's the current doc producer. All were great, and all were incredibly organized, and knew, I think the key to what you're saying is that the question you're asking is, you have to kind of have a general outline of where you want to go with your story as you're beginning, because they've done a lot of research, and they kind of know, here are the major players, here are the major issues, and here's probably where it's going to land. But on more than one occasion, I would say probably a third of the time, we would work on a documentary, and it's like, well, we thought it was this, but it's really this. And I'll give you an example. I was working with Clay on a documentary about migrant farm workers in North Carolina, and the living conditions that they were dealing with when they would travel around from farm to farm. And we thought that we were going to find that North Carolina, that these farmers were not meeting the standards, the housing standards for the workers.
Yeah.
Turned out, no, the problem was the standards were so low.
Wow.
So, like they called it. The big issue was about beds. They had to. A farmer had to provide a bed for a worker, but he didn't have to provide a mattress.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. And so the doc kind of makes a hard left-hand turn to this isn't about the farmers. This is about the state's regulations and guidelines aren't high enough. So there was a lot of that type stuff.
That's crazy. Now you covered a lot, sports, otherwise. I don't know if it works like this with what you did, so maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
But were there any assignments you were given or suggested that you turned down that you look back and wish that you hadn't?
I think the one, and it's not really one that I turned down. There was a situation we were working on a documentary about the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and we needed to go to Washington D.C. and do a couple interviews up there, and then at the last minute, like 2 or 3 days before we were supposed to go, they said, "Oh, we need to do this other interview while you're up there. If you guys can squeeze it in, we need to interview John Glenn." He was going to. I don't know if anybody remembers, the astronaut John Glenn. One of the things he did late in his life was he was actually an astronaut on one of the shuttles when he was like in his 70s or 80s, and so I was always a big space nut, and I was just floored to get the opportunity to meet John Glenn. Well, like the day before I was supposed to go, I was out working in my yard and I stepped on a rusty nail and jammed it up into my foot. And I just knew I had to go get a tetanus shot and all that sort of stuff. So I had to pass off the assignment at the last minute to a buddy of mine, Mark Copeland, who did a great job. And Mark may have appreciated the Glenn interview even more than I did. But that's one I always look like, oh man, John Glenn. Oh well.
Yeah. Man. Now, speaking of, assignments, all these other things, you were for WRL for 43 years.
Yep.
I remember saying that's a long time. That's really great.
Yep.
What are some, speaking about like local news media, what are some misconceptions you think the average person has about it? How it works, how it operates, or
it's with all the talk these days of fake news and questioning the news media. I worked with a guy a few years ago who I remember somebody came up to him and said, "You guys have a hidden agenda, and you guys are trying to drive your own viewpoints." And and he said, "You know what our viewpoint? You know what our hidden agenda is? Getting it on the air. Our hidden agenda is not having video for all the stories we shoot and getting making sure that when the news comes on, the news is on." And that really is true. I mean, I think if there's any, be careful how I say this because I still have lots of friends and some family members who work in local media, that they produce, and I'll even say we, because I'm once a member of the Big Five, always a member of the Big Five. We produce so much content that you got to move so fast. I think that's where the danger is. That's where the danger is your scripts aren't checked like, back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, we were producing a lot of content, a lot of newscast, but back in those days, Dylan, we did a half hour at 6 in the morning, we did a half hour at noon, we did a half hour at 6, and a half hour at 11. Now we come on, I think at WRL comes on at 4 or 4:30 in the morning, and they're on until 9 o'clock. They come back on from noon until 1, and then they're back on the air from 4 all the way until basically 8 o'clock. Then they do an hour at 10, and then a half hour at 11. That's a lot of content, man.
Yeah.
And so it's just hard. We don't. Scripts aren't checked and edited. I'm not saying they're not checked and edited. Right. They are, but just not like they used to be. That's where the pros like, Deborah Morgan and Gerald Owens, David Crabtree, Charlie Gaddy, they sit up there and, stuff is changing like crazy and they can hold it together. I think that's where the term, they call them news anchors for a reason. they're the steadying influence when there's chaos going all around.
Yeah. I've always been curious, like speaking about news anchors, which I know you weren't a news anchor, but you were in the field.
Yeah.
I've always been wondering, like, if I was a news anchor and I had to report on a story, and so like I'm reporting a story, reading the teleprompter, and maybe I am disagreeing with the angle or the emphasis, or how did they do that? Where I don't know. Here's what they're being told to say this thing, and you got to go with what you're told. How does that work?
Well,
on a personal level.
Yeah, that's a great question. Now if it's in a, what we call breaking news, or when we're wall-to-wall coverage, let's say a hurricane or, some sort of, natural disaster or something, that's less about, having to worry about your opinion, or, that's more being a traffic cop, getting from place to place, describing what you're saying. I've been, they have news meetings, they have editorial meetings in the morning and afternoon. I know at WRAL, and I'm sure every TV station and every network does as well. And you'll hash some stuff out. There'll be, that doesn't happen on the air.
Right.
And they will do a debrief and talk about, hey, we did this, should we have done that? And occasionally that happens, but really most of those, the tension, and I think it's a healthy tension. I think that's got to be part of the process of, here's how we're going to cover things. Hey, have you thought about this? Hey, don't forget to interview this person. Those things do happen. It's not like they just plow ahead with, we're always going to do it this way. There's a constant. My daughter-in-law, Martha, she's the executive producer she's managing editor for WRAL News to this day, and she's excellent. She's always pushing back, making sure that that we're asking hard questions of each other, and I think that's key.
Yeah, that's good. Now I'm curious. 43 years, retired last year, in the industry for a long time. Mm-hmm. Saw a ton of technological changes. Cameras getting better, standard definition, HD, streaming, cable, like all these.
Yeah.
What was that like, trying to keep up with it all?
In the beginning, it wasn't bad because the technology wasn't changing that much. Like when I started, WRA was still shooting a little bit of 16 millimeter film, but mostly shooting 3/4 inch videotape. And we shot 3/4 inch videotape from really almost all videotape from 81 until 87, when we changed to a different videotape technology. And then we ran with that one for almost, over 10 years. So then it didn't change, but then it got crazy. Yeah. Once HD rolled in 98, 99, it was constant. It was constant, because now we go from using physical machines, edit machines, with videotape that you put in. Now you're doing everything on computers. Mm-hmm. So now the learning curve just skyrockets. And I remember there had to be a change of mindset of I'm either going to, I can sit there and complain about the fact that everything's changing.
Yeah.
Or I can become a lifelong learner. And, I'm going to have to learn this new software. I'm going to have to learn this new camera. I'm going to have to learn, this latest technology or a new application. Yeah. So that was really, but to go from, and I've lost count of how many different cameras I've been assigned that I had over the years. But, I started in 16 millimeter film with a little bit of videotape until at the end I was shooting 4K. I never, as I told somebody one time, I thought the last K I was going to have to worry about was my 401k. But anyway, I really enjoyed it. It was frustrating at times. For instance, I was honored to be part of the first first of all, WRAL was the first local station to broadcast in high definition and then produce in high definition. And think about all the other stations in the United States. Wow. As part of that, we were the first station to produce a documentary and it was an hour-long documentary in HD.
Wow.
And I remember when they called us into the meeting, it was Scott Mason and me, and the chief engineer was in there, and the news director, and they were talking about how your next one's going to be in high definition, and it's going to be on. I think we even had decided it was going to be on the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and I remember they were saying, "Well, you'll use this camera. This will be your tripod, and we think you're going to edit with this." They weren't sure, and I'm like asking questions like, "Well, how are we going to put the names on the screen, the graphics?" And I go, "I don't know." And I'm asking questions like, "What mics we're going to use?" I don't know. And so I remember turning to Scott and saying, "I kind of feel like this is NASA sitting down with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, say, 'Hey guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to fly you to the moon. We're not sure how we're going to get you back yet, but trust, when you get there, we'll figure it out.'" And it was really cool because we did figure it out, and we did some crazy stuff to make it happen, and that's the beauty of working at Capital Broadcasting and WRAL, in that they. Jim Goodman, who was the president and CEO of the company, loves technology, loves being first, loves that whole pushing the technological envelope. So we were always doing stuff like that, doing stuff like that. We always talked about how the leading edge is the bleeding edge, because you're trying stuff and sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Now I'm curious.
Yeah.
Obviously, your faith is important to you. Follow Jesus. And fair or unfair, you have different opinions about this. News media, sometimes doesn't seem to be the most favorable towards Christians and certain Christian beliefs and leanings, morality, that sort of thing. So what was that like, living out your faith in not just normal world, but maybe in an industry that maybe is not the most fond of Christians?
That's a great question. And there were times I didn't live it out very well. And right up front, I was thinking about that while I was driving over here, getting ready for the interview, just thinking, if there are any regrets, there's some of my 23 years ago, I didn't walk like I should have walked. I didn't talk like I should have talked, and I regret that because there were people watching. I will say, however, and while I think it's drifted. It's just like all of culture.
Yeah.
There's way more of a divide today than there was, in the 80s or 90s or even the early 2000s. So, and I'll say this. What I found was, and I think a lot of folks would be surprised, there are a lot of passionate Christ followers who work, or let me just say, who worked at WRAL, and I'm sure there still are. I have no doubt about that. Who worked at WRAL, and we actually had men's groups, Bible studies that we would occasionally pull together of the folks, because we kind of felt like we were dealing with, our faith was being met in a different way than if you were, a carpenter or a plumber or work for IBM. So that was really important to know that there were other folks there. I mean, I got to tell you, David Crabtree is one of those guys who he and I really developed a deep friendship, especially in our faith. Now David is Episcopal, so that's very different from my Baptist and community church background. But there was few things better to me than grabbing a cup of coffee with David and just talking about Jesus and how awesome he is and how he guides us. I would say what I realized, and it was late in my time at WRAL, I was trying to figure out over the years, from a professional standpoint, who am I? What do I bring to the table? And if I were to ever leave WRAL, how would I describe myself? What's the skill set that I could bring to if I left, go to work for First Citizens Bank or, IBM or, Duke Power, something like that. What? And I landed on, well, I'm a storyteller. That's what I'm a storyteller. And then the light bulb went on, and I realized, well, that's what I am in my faith. I'm a storyteller. I get to share the greatest story that's ever going to be told.
Yeah.
And so that really, and then, so for the last few years, that really became what I did. I kind of felt like we did it, and it was when we did this. We did several stories on addiction, especially on the opioid crisis, and I really felt like what we were doing was people were handing us these very tender, delicate, personal stories. And our job was to get them from here over to the viewer and to honor them, not to make too much of them. Don't sensationalize them because they don't need to be sensationalized, but also give them the gravity that they're worth, that they deserve. And that's kind of where we landed. Where I landed with that's really what we do.
Yeah, it's great. Jay, if you could change one thing about local news media or local media, what would it be?
That's a great question. I think I would say more reporters and photographers on the street. Going out the door. And the other thing that's hard is, for the longest time over my days in local news, when the TV crew showed up, everybody was excited. Everybody was glad to see, the TV truck or the camera come out of the back of the car. It's not the case anymore.
Yep.
It's not the case anymore. As a matter of fact, it became what I went from. One of my favorite things to do was drive around and get shots that supported a documentary. Spend a day driving to eastern North Carolina to shoot tobacco fields or, along the coastline, lighthouses and things like that. In the end, I didn't like it because you get catcall, and I'm a big boy, I can take it. But it's just that was really hard to have that change. I actually, was shot at once, and actually assaulted by somebody once, because I was a member of the news media.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
now you spent not only your whole career in the industry, you also spent 43 years in one company, which is a feat in of itself. What was it like? And maybe what has it continued to be like since you stepped away and retired?
First of all, it doesn't happen. Why it happened with me, I don't know. Maybe it's because I was afraid to take another job. Maybe because nobody else would hire me. And it's not like there's times I did look for a job, times I didn't. But I'll say this. I think the biggest reason why I didn't leave was Jim Goodman, President and CEO of Capital Broadcasting. Somehow, some way, we ended up having a relationship. I really respected him, and he looked out for me on several occasions. And it's just if you're gonna work at a local TV station, that's a great company to work for. I mean, at least for the 43 years I was there, I said before, WRL is a really, really good station. At times it was really great. It's like any company, any business, it's gonna wax and wane. But I think it was a really good station with a great company. And I think that's one of the reasons why I always stayed there.
Yeah. What do you miss most?
People say this all the time, but it's the people.
Yeah.
I got buddies and friends who I just miss seeing them every day, and that actually, I think, Dylan, one of the things that for me helped me move away was work from home during COVID, during the pandemic. We figured out some ways to work because of COVID. We did, they always thought, well, you could never work from home. All that. Well, yeah, you can. We figured it out. But what that did was, and I didn't think about it at the time, it prepped my wife, Debbie, and me. It prepped us for what life was going to be like when I did leave work. And we found out, hey, I kind of like hanging out with you. So that was a plus. And the other part of it was, I think it kind of weaned me off the relationships of seeing everybody every day. So whenever I left the station, I wasn't leaving, 50 people I see every day.
Right.
I was having interactions with Kristen Severance, the doc producer at the time, and a couple other folks, but I think that really helped that. So it really wasn't this, I was just really hurting because all these people had suddenly left my life. I realized, well, wait a second, I haven't seen some of these folks for 2 years, because I would go in, but not, I wasn't going in every day.
Yeah.
So I think I miss the people, and I would realize that at times during after my sports days. Occasionally, when a couple of the documentaries, we jumped back in and did things like at the ACC tournament that involved sports, and you go in and you start seeing all the people that you used to hang out with for 7-8 years, because they're still at the Greensboro News and Record or WFMY in Greensboro or wherever, and you realize, man, these were cool folks to hang out with.
Yeah, that's great.
It's always the people.
Yeah, I'm curious too. I mean, you spent a lot of time in the industry, a lot of time with people behind the camera. No doubt, some of the news anchors, some of the fellow coworkers had really big aspirations. We want to do national media, big time. How hard is it for those of us that just see people on the screen and must be nice, you get to be on TV every day? How hard is it to make it as a news anchor, sports anchor, like a front of camera talent, personality? How competitive is it? How hard is it?
It's very competitive. I was fortunate enough to work with. I'm trying to think of all the different. Bobby Batista, who ended up going to. She was at CNN for years. I know the one everybody knows is Stuart Scott. Stuart was at WRAL for a couple of years,
cool.
And before he was actually a news reporter. Think about that, a news reporter at WRAL. Wow. Before he got his break in Orlando to go, to the worldwide leader after that, and just a great guy. I could go on and on about Stuart. Jim Axelrod, who's now a CBS national correspondent. And Jim was the White House correspondent for CBS for many years. A good friend of mine. Brett Baer, who's on Fox News. So the question is, what does it take? It takes a lot of talent. It takes a lot of talent. And to some degree, it takes being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
I think there's this, I mentioned Jim Axelrod. Jim, his break was CBS hired him, and he was kind of the backup correspondent out of Miami. And so he wasn't getting much airtime. And the guy whoever, I can't remember who it was, went on vacation. And when Jim stepped into the lead for a couple of weeks, there was a hostage situation in Bogota, Colombia.
Wow.
And they flew Axe to Bogota to cover. And the next, 2 days later, Dan Rather's pitching to the story on the CBS Evening News saying, our man in Bogota, Jim Axelrod, has this report. Yeah. And so it's just, and the great thing about it is Jimmy is just the best. He's just, you love it when good things happen to great folks, and that's a perfect example.
Yeah. I'm curious too, what work-life balance, I know some people like that phrase, people don't, but what does that look like for someone in your industry? How do you not, how do you do healthy, breaking news, there's always something, especially today. Yeah. How do you do that well?
Yep. It's really hard. I think that's one of the hardest things about it. It's one of the things I think my move into the documentary side, I think extended my time in local TV maybe by 20 years.
Wow.
because I then had way more control over my schedule. I really was working most of the time, Monday through Friday, and could take my lunch in and all that sort of stuff. Didn't mean we didn't travel. Didn't mean we didn't go. We would.
Right.
But I think that's a hard thing. I think that's because one of the things you have to do in local TV news, especially if you're in the field as a reporter or a video person, videographer, your life is not your own. It's not, and you go in every day. Now you can be proactive with your assignments and try to find great stories, and the good ones do. And I think you need to have that. But generally, your day is going to be in the hands of a news director, a managing editor, an assignment editor, and they're going to decide where you're going to go. And I can remember there's a story of years ago, this reporter going into the assignment editor saying, "Hey, I want to work with this camera person today." And the assignment editor goes, "This ain't no disco. You don't get to pick your partner. You're going to go with this person." So it's a lot of that. And you kind of have to hold that with an open hand and just be, there's many times, I can remember a situation where I went into work one day thinking I was going to do some paperwork and do some, because it was when I was chief photographer and get caught up on some administrative stuff. And 20 minutes later, I'm in a car racing down I-40 to RDU to catch a flight to Springfield, Missouri, because some fugitive from North Carolina has just been captured in Springfield. So it's stuff like that would happen all the time.
Yeah, that's really cool. Now you you were in this industry for a long time. Obviously, it's changed quite a bit over the years.
Yep.
But if you were to start over, or if somebody was thinking, how do you even get into this industry? What do you do to get your foot in the door? How do you start out?
The cool thing is today it's way different than it was in when I went to college, and I started college in 77 or summer of 76 actually. It's in those days nobody had a video camera. There weren't smartphones. There weren't there wasn't editing on there were computers to edit on. You had to have some equipment to do it. And so most of the guys that I went to college with who wanted to do camera work, they had done still photography at high school, shooting for the yearbook, shooting for the school newspaper, maybe for the local paper. I'd done none of that. So the advantage you have today is not only do you have, most everybody, everybody, I'm not going to say most everybody has shot with their phone.
Yeah.
So you generally know what video is and probably have edited it somehow, some way. So you've got that. So it's very different. I would say, boy, what's the best way I can say this? Maybe I'll just say it. Be good. Have a great attitude. I think it's like any other job. I think having a great attitude, being willing to show up and work hard, and be a good worker. I think that maybe I'm oversimplifying it.
Yeah.
Obviously, I still think writing. Even though I shot video, my background through journalism school was learning how to write, and I think being able, to tell a story, you've got to learn to tell a story, on a keyboard. Or in my day, a typewriter before you could tell it on a screen.
Yeah.
So beginning, middle, and end. What are the compelling pieces of a story? How do you make that work in local TV a minute 15?
Right.
But I'll also say that my son who worked in local TV for many years, we used to talk about this, and I kind of realized that anybody can be good on their best day. Anybody can be. You get a great assignment with a great subject for your story. And it's a beautiful day, and it's a visual story. Just about anybody can knock that one out of the park. How good are you on your bad day?
Yeah.
Can you still deliver the goods whenever it's hard? Your camera's not working right. You got a bad mic. Your tripod won't level out. you're late, your car broke down. Can you still deliver the goods? I mean, I think it's, I think that's when in golf, Tiger Woods would talk about, some days you got to grind. You just got to grind. And I think that's when you didn't, I didn't have my A game today. I think that's when you don't have your A game, when everything's working against you, when you're out there in the hurricane and your lens is fogged up, and you've got water in your shoes. How good's your story? I think that's can you? And I think that's a transferable principle, no matter what industry you're in, whatever your craft is. Can you deliver the goods whenever in a presentable product? When somebody, if somebody were to ask you, how did you do that? Well, I don't know, because my tripod broke and I had to balance my camera on a cinder block to shoot the interview, which I've done before.
Nice. That's nice. Jay, this is fascinating. You've had quite the career. After 43 years of all you've done, the success you've had, I feel like it's okay to brag on yourself a little bit. So my last question, I'd love to know, you look back at your time at WRAL, 43 years in the industry, what are you most proud of?
You know what? Lots of stuff. I'm really proud that my son, that I got to work with him. That was really special. As a matter of fact, at the day of my last day at the station, he spoke, and man, it was amazing. I mean, just to hear your son talk about you like that was absolutely amazing. I'll say the other one was, and I know what's going to happen. We're going to stop recording, and then I'm going to think, oh, I should have said this. Yeah. But I think the very last piece I worked on was on the fentanyl crisis. And we'd done a couple of pieces earlier on addiction and opioids. But this one was particularly hard. And there were two elements. We told three stories in this hour, basically the three stories. And one was the mom of a young man in the Burlington area. But the other two were Will and Diane Stevenson, who go to the same church, go to Hope with my wife and me. They lost not one, but two sons to addiction. And them sharing their story. And the other one was, and this was hard for me to talk about. Our goddaughter, Amanda Nash, died of a fentanyl overdose. And to interview her parents, good friends, Jeff and Lori. That was hard. It was really hard. And to know that, have one of your best friends look through the lens of your camera and say, I failed as a dad. Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, it just rips your heart out. I mean, so to say that, so why is that a highlight? It was a highlight in that here was my last story. And I do think God's hand was on it. It'd been real easy to mail the last one in, and just kind of skip to the finish line. No, I couldn't. There was no way in the world I was going to go half speed on this one and jog it in. This was one I ran hard to the finish line of my time there. And honestly, didn't realize how fried I was and how empty I was until I got to the finish line.
Yeah. But
I'm incredibly glad that I did. Again, so to say it's a highlight, it's hard. I guess I'm proud of that piece and the story it told. I hate the pain that led up to telling that story, but I also can say, having talked to Will and Diane Stevenson and talking to Jeff and Lori Nash, sharing their stories and telling their stories was a way for, they felt, and I agree with them, that those stories could be redeemed, that they could have value, and they could make a difference in somebody's life. I think that's part of being a storyteller. Yeah. And I hope, honored to tell a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, Jay, thank you for sharing some of your stories with us today and all that you've done through, and really interesting conversation. And so I just appreciate you taking the time.
You're more than welcome, Dylan. Thank you for asking.